Play different.
Dark Castle is a classic Macintosh game. Many people also consider it to be one of the worst games ever made, thanks to a number of shoddy ports to other systems. Sadly, in recent years, it's these versions, such as the Genesis Mega Drive and CDI ones, that are most well known thanks to YouTubers like the Irate Digital Entertainment Geek. But I'm here to set the record straight. The original Dark Castle was a technical marvel and broke new ground in game design, and most importantly, is still a darn fun game. Well, assuming you have the patience for some very old-fashioned game mechanics and an often brutal difficulty level. Let's get the least remarkable thing out of the way first, which is the story. The Black Knight has been terrorizing the townsfolk, so Prince Duncan heads off to the Dark Castle to topple the villainous knight off his throne. Right, now onto the actual game itself. At a glance, Dark Castle may appear to be a cinematic platformer like the later games Prince of Persia and Another World. There certainly are similarities, such as the use of non-scrolling screens, a focus on detailed animation, although it is admittedly much choppier than in the other mentioned games, and controls that attempt to simulate human movement rather than abstract it. What I mean here is that in something like a Super Mario game, pressing jump will immediately send a player's character into the air. In cinematic platformers, first you need to wind that baby up. But the other games I mentioned can often feel very strict and rigid, which can leave players feeling like they are following a script. This is not the case with Dark Castle. Of course, there are still plenty of sections which require precise movement and memorization, but there are also many random elements to contend with. So perhaps arcade cinematic platformer would be a more accurate description. In fact, some screens feature blatant rip-offs of older arcade games such as Donkey Kong, Donkey Kong Jr. and Galaga. And I will mention that the designer of Dark Castle, Mark Stephen Pierce, insisted that I actually call them rip-offs. Wait, some of you may say, Galaga? How could they rip off a shoot-'em-up in a platformer? Well, I'm glad you asked. Not only did players make the hero run and hop around with the keyboard, but they could also aim his arm around with a mouse and then click to hurl rocks or fireballs at enemies. Rocks arc through the air, whereas fireballs will just keep on heading in their thrown trajectory and are more powerful. Of course, the reason rocks are an option is because players don't start with the fireball. That power lies behind one of the doors selectable from the start of the game, each guarding a set of 3 levels. The door leading to the shield power, which bestows temporary invulnerability, is clearly marked, but the 2 doors on the left have question marks above them. One leads to the fireball set of levels, and the other leads to the dungeon set named Trouble, which you have to descend to the bottom of and then return back to the top once you have retrieved a key. The set of levels the doors lead to are randomized each time you start a new game. This discourages players from trying to nab the shield first, despite how powerful it is, because if players initially go for the fireball but end up in the dungeon, they can just restart the game. But here's my advice. Get the shield first, and deal with the dungeon if you have to. You're going to need to get good at those levels anyway, for reasons I'll talk about later. The middle door always goes to the last set of levels, concluding with the final battle with the Black Knight. It's actually possible with a good amount of practice to head straight there and finish the game in under 2 minutes. But if you try to pull that off, be prepared for a lot of restarts. And I am only talking about the easiest difficulty here. The final levels always being available also caused confusion for some players who were immediately overwhelmed. The team prevented this from happening in the sequel, Beyond Dark Castle, by implementing the orb system, but I'll talk more about that game in a separate video. Something I'm sure you've noticed by now is how the game looks and sounds. It very much has a cartoon vibe going, and in fact, the aim was to make a living, interactive animation. This was all thanks to the combination of detailed sprites and backgrounds by Pierce, which were displayed smoothly and flicker-free thanks to code wizardry from Jonathan Gay, and digitized sound effects recorded and implemented by Eric Zoker. It all came together to form a game packed with personality that even pervaded how it played. Here is an example of a fun detail. At one point you have a choice between two keys, and if you don't pay attention to the prisoners next to you, this will happen. Additionally, Duncan is as klutzy as Inspector Clouseau. At least, he is when under the control of most new players, who end up slamming him into walls, or cause him to simply trip over a step, which results in him face planting before stumbling back up, swaying around dizzy for a moment, then shaken off the impact before getting back to the action. He can even run straight off a ledge where he will hover in the air for a moment, look down, give a defeated look to the player, then fall, generally to his death. It's like a slapstick cartoon, and one where it can often feel like the player is the butt of the jokes. This is certainly a game where it helps to have a sense of humour. Especially since it definitely feels like the game is trolling you at times, such as with the pits. Should the player fall down a pit that goes off screen, they won't die. Oh no, they will suffer a fate worse than death. Instead, they'll be sent to the bottom of the dungeon, and have to climb back to the top to resume their adventure. But it's not all bad news, since it helps the player stock up on rocks, lives, and elixirs, the latter of which are very helpful in the endgame because they prevent plague-ridden rats and bats from being instant kills. But if you're not careful, it can result in doing the dungeon over and over and over to the point where you'd rather just lose a life and restart the screen you were on rather than trudge up those dang dungeon stairs once more. Those pits truly are the pits. Like many games of the era, it can be brutal. There are instant kill enemies, small falls can lead to a quick death, and as mentioned, tripping over a step can stun the player and leave them wide open to an enemy attack. Of course, at the time, people were used to high difficulties. This came out the same year as Ghosts and Goblins after all, and much like that title, Dark Castle is a game that requires patience as you learn its ins and outs. Pierce, recognizing that more casual experiences are in vogue these days, has thought about how he would revisit the difficulty should he ever redesign it, but has said that too is a great challenge in itself. But, at least in my opinion, if you can deal with some frustration, it's definitely worth playing. It's a great looking, sounding, and playing platform adventure game packed with personality, not to mention variety. To discuss that, let's go back to one of Dark Castle's inspirations, Donkey Kong. DK only had 4 levels, but each one of them felt very different to the last. Dark Castle follows a similar formula. Each hall door leads to a set of 3 or 4 levels, and each of them feel different to the last. In addition to the previously mentioned arcade homages, there are also some simple puzzles to solve, a dragon you must contend with, a whip-wielding guard who must be duelled, lightning to dodge, a river to traverse, mocking mutants to mash, and more. It all makes the game feel like a real adventure rather than just a series of levels, and the personality stops it from feeling like a collection of mechanics. Although I feel I should warn that the ending is very underwhelming. The Black Knight falls off his throne, Duncan does a little jig, and then you're thrown right back in the dungeon to restart the game. The reason for this, of course, is so you can try to increase your score. And here is a fun bit of trivia. Pierce signed his initials on most of the screens. See if you can spot them through the video. Dark Castle was the follow-up to Airborne, the first game from Silicon Beach Software, a company which spawned from Charlie Jackson being able to afford expensive hardware and then trusting a high school student to do much of the work for him. But for a more detailed history, see my Airborne video. Like Airborne, Dark Castle was programmed by Jonathan Gay on the Apple Lisa, and again, mostly in 68K assembly. One of the more technically impressive things about the game is solving the flicker problem that plagued many other Macintosh titles. Gay used hardware page flipping, which was only vaguely documented by Apple, and although Gay felt it was a bit of a hack, it made full-screen, flicker-free animation possible. For the art and design, Silicon Beach brought someone new onto the team, Mark Steven Pierce. Pierce had made quite a name for himself with his digital art and animation, and had already worked on some games, including the obscure Professor Pac-Man. The initial vision for Dark Castle was radically different to the final product. Originally, the player would be someone with modern weapons and would jump through portals at the end of each stage. Each level would be different to the last, with a distinct setting and set of enemies. This concept was inspired by various sci-fi TV shows and a board game called Time Tripper. It was also going to have a darker, more horror-inspired tone rather than the comedic one it ended up with. To put it frankly, Pierce thought that this idea was stupid, and in a burst of inspiration at their first meeting, basically freestyled the entire game in front of a flip chart. He managed to change the rest of the team's mind despite his somewhat callous attitude, and Dark Castle began development. In addition to the arcade games mentioned earlier, Pierce was also heavily influenced by the Prince Valiant comics, which were first syndicated way back in 1937. There was also the 1977 book Castle by David McCulley, which was a detailed illustrated description of a fictional castle. The comedic elements were inspired by Burger Time, which Pierce thought had amusing animations, and also the slapstick stylings of the Three Stooges. Pierce was located in Chicago, while the rest of the team were in San Diego. For this reason, Pierce would draw and animate assets, the former done using Silicon's upcoming app, Superpaint, then mail his work to Gay via good old floppy disk. Gay would then take these visual and design elements, combine them with code, then send a build back to Pierce, with this back and forth going on for about 4 months. For the sound, Eric Zoker, who handled all the technical aspects of audio, spent a few hours with 71-year-old Dick Noel, a semi-retired voice actor veteran who voiced Fred Flintstone in the pilot episode. He improvised various voices and sound effects in his studio, and ended up providing every single voice in the game, except for the one of the whipped prisoner, which was provided by Jackson. Dark Castle was one of the first games, if not the first, to use a professional for sound in this manner. 1983's Dragon's Lair, for example, hired an actor for the narration, but the actual in-game voices were provided by members of the animation team rather than actual voiceover artists. In regards to using the mouse in the game, Pierce says that since the Mac was the first publicly available computer with a mouse, there was simply no way they could not use it. Dark Castle also used the WASD keys in combination with the mouse, which is now a standard. Pierce doesn't remember how the control method came about, and doesn't think they came up with it because it would make them geniuses. Well, it looks like they're geniuses, because as of recording, it most definitely is the earliest known example of WASD plus mouse controls. I suspect it was born out of necessity, as the original Mac keyboard had no arrow keys or numpad. If it did, it is quite possible they would have been used instead of WASD, but without them, they would have had to find a comfortable alternative, and WASD has always felt right with the mouse. As mentioned, Dark Castle was ported to numerous computers and consoles, and most of them were abysmal. Many were an ugly mess visually, and most weren't too hot in the audio area either. Worst of all, mouse support was often missing, which basically destroyed the entire experience. I do not recommend playing any of the ports, especially the Genesis Mega Drive version. Instead, read Bad Game Hall of Fame's excellent article about that train wreck, which I've linked to in the video description. There was, however, an excellent 1994 color remake on the Mac. It was very faithful to the original, with a few quality of life changes such as the ability to save, and the question marks removed from the doors so the player always knows where they're heading. There is also a mode that cuts out 3/4 of the game if you want the abridged version. There was even a brand new secret level. The third game in the series, Return to Dark Castle, features the levels from the original game and Beyond Dark Castle, and includes many of the changes found in the color remake. This installment is available from the App Store and is on Steam, and is a great way to experience the original game today, plus there is a whole bunch of new content. The third game is Mac only. Dark Castle was a massive critical success, not only in Macintosh circles where it won numerous awards, but also with multi-platform publications such as Byte, computer gaming world, and even in the tabletop role-playing game magazine Dragon, where it was described as the finest arcade adventure game ever designed. Now that's high praise. It was also a staggering commercial success, with Gay's cut of the sales allowing him to pay for his entire college tuition. It also managed to stay on Macworld's top-selling entertainment titles list for a whopping 39 months. But the game did more than just make celebrities out of the developers. Dark Castle was a technical achievement not only on the Macintosh, but for games in general. The detailed visuals and digitized sound showed what computer games were capable of. It showed that a deep, arcade-quality experience could be had at home, and one that was packed with personality. Put quite simply, there wasn't anything quite like it. And although some design elements certainly haven't aged as gracefully as others, and it can feel a bit clunky, it's still a very playable game today. The Dark Castle games, in addition to Airborne, also paved the way for Macromedia Flash, which Gay would go on to create. Writing games was an important part of my computer education and the beginning of my inspiration for Flash, he says, because I learned about animation, digitized sound, and how to synchronize the two. Most importantly, I learned that fast and responsive software is fun to use. When I asked Pierce about ports of the game, he told me, and I quote, that they all sucked. You don't have to agree with this, but the groundbreaking Macintosh original is definitely the game that should be remembered when people bring up the name Dark Castle.